just going to focus a little bit on Samson and some of the details there. And we'd expect to find more of the same, although Samson's probably the most robust account with regards to a cycle of a judge. Just while I'm remembering this, just for everybody's sake, if you're interested in following through into, after Ruth, we finish Ruth this semester and pick right up in the spring semester with the history books, Samuel, Kings, and the non-prophet books. We'll finish that in the spring semester. My course is up, and it'll be pretty much looking the same as it does this semester. So just so you know, I've asked the group discussion question for this week is not a heavy hitter. I kind of pulled back a little bit, but I'm getting some surveillance and is asking for your honest critique and some feedback from you. I know we're not at the end of the semester yet, but I'm interested now in hearing from you and some things that you really liked about how this class was designed, your experience of the class, and as we move forward, there's a particular kind of class that, as an institution, a few of us around are experimenting with. Not that you all are guinea pigs or anything, but I'd like to hear from you now because I'm going to start, even before the end of the semester, doing some evaluation and helping some others do the same as we move ahead to this spring. So your feedback, honest feedback, will be greatly appreciated in my group discussion question for this week, just to let you know. All right, so I appreciate that. But let's look at Samson. And in chapter 13, let's see here. Paul, where are you? I know you're here. Could you read for us beginning in chapter 13, verses 1 through 5?
And the people of Israel again did what was evil in the sight of the Lord. So the Lord gave them into the hand of the Philistines for 40 years. There was a certain man of Zorah, of the tribe of Danites, whose name was Manoah. And his wife was barren and had no children. And the angel of the Lord appeared to the woman and said to her, Behold, you are barren and have not borne children. She shall conceive and bear a son. Therefore, be careful and drink no wine or strong drink, and eat nothing unclean. For behold, you shall conceive and bear a son. No razor shall come upon his head, for the child shall be a Nazarite to God from the womb, and he shall begin to save Israel from the hand of the Philistines.
Okay. Well, there's a lot in this first little... Yeah, go ahead.
Quick question.
Yeah.
In regards to this Nazarite birth of John, of Samson, isn't this a John typology? We see John the Baptist later on, the opening of the Gospels. There's similar instructions with John.
Okay.
Correct. Because I've heard it preached, but someone was talking about John, and they were talking about all this stuff, and I was like, man, it sounds just like Samson. And so I was just curious. I know that's a New Testament question, but is this Nazarite vow that Samson is going to be under the same type of vow that John the Baptist is under?
I think there's similarities that you go back to Numbers chapter 6, and the Nazarite vow situation is described in detail.
Yes.
So the Nazarite, here these details are applied to the mother, but the Nazarite situation for Samson when he's born would apply to him in terms of the vow. So I think there's going to be similarity in the Nazarite category in Israel as they move ahead. It's interesting in this passage, the similarity also to how we get launched with Samuel and the barrenness of, there in Samuel chapter 1, and the Elkanah and Hannah. Hannah's barren, and it's a very similar situation. But what we have with Samson is kind of, will end up radically different than what we have with the birth of Samuel, who will come on the scene and eventually get us to Israel's true king, King David, to kind of, maybe as a foil, that word just means kind of what Samson illustrates is kind of a situation similar to Saul, where Israel starts with the king, but it's a false start. where we have Samson as a foil against Samuel, whereas Samson's kind of a false start, and then we've got Samuel, which, he's, God's man for the job. So there's interesting contrasts there and connections between Judges as we skip over Ruth to Samuel as the history books continue. But we've got the similarity in the significant similarity there in the angel of the Lord, or the messenger of the Lord, right? Appearing to the barren situation in the woman and announcing that a child will be born. So we see this divine intervention, and we see that while we'd hope for, maybe with the Samson situation and scenario, something more happening as a result, but it's an interesting kind of tension in the Samson account where I guess what I'm saying is you have such a strong start, but where does it go? We're still deeply entrenched in this downward spiral, and it may be taking a few starts and divine interruptions to kind of steer this train, big train, or this maybe that you might think of it as a barge out in the open ocean. It takes a long time to redirect something of that bulk moving across the water. So I'm just trying to think of some illustrations. But nonetheless, we have the divine interruption. And then in verse 21, later in that chapter, the angel of the Lord appears no more to Manoah or his wife. Then Manoah knew that he was an angel of the Lord, a messenger of the Lord. Manoah says to his wife, "We will surely die, for we've seen God." But his wife says, "If the Lord has desired to kill us, he would have not accepted a burnt offering and a grain offering from our hands. Nor would he have shown us all these things, nor would he have let us hear these things at this time." So the woman gives birth and names him Samson, which in Hebrew means sunny. His name is built off the Hebrew word that means sun. So kind of like naming your kid Sonny, I guess. I wouldn't call it a pagan name. It might be a name that has some kind of, maybe some ray of hope. No pun intended, but a ray of hope for the future, that this thing might turn around. So we have him named Sonny in verse 24 and 25. And again, verse 25 gives us a signal that maybe we've got some bright ray of hope coming on the scene. You see in verse 25, and the capital S, Spirit of the Lord began to stir him in Menon-Edan between Zorah and Eshtaol. So the Spirit of the Lord begins to stir in Samson. All right. We maybe just have landed and God has intervened, and now we have the man for the job. So we'll wait and see. We're hopeful. We're a reader, ancient reader. We're hearing this and getting this in a sermon delivered to us or read to us, and we're on pins and needles waiting for what happens next. Chapter 14, verse 1. Let's see. Paul, could you keep reading there for us?
Samson went down to Timnah, and at Timnah he saw one of the daughters of the Philistines. Then he came up and told his father and mother, "I saw one of the daughters of the Philistines at Timnah. Now get her for me as my wife." But his father and mother said to him, "Is there not a woman among the daughters of your relatives, or among all our people, that she must go to take a wife from the uncircumcised Philistines?" But Samson said to his father, "Get her for me, for she is right in my eyes." His father and mother did not know that it was from the Lord, for he was seeking an opportunity against the Philistines. At that time, the Philistines ruled over Israel.
All right, so we've got it all kind of packed in there. Of course, the Philistines now will be the oppressor. They're along the eastern border of the Mediterranean Sea. You see that. Some of our geography here, Timnah, Zorah, and you can see how close these Israelite small towns in those days, very small towns, were to the Philistine cities. So Timnah is a Philistine city, and just across the valley is Zorah, and very, very close to that's Jerusalem. So not very far at all in terms of geography. and there was probably in those days, because of what we've already known and already seen, along the borders of these, between the Philistines and Israel, because of what we know, the unconquered nations or the unconquered situation, these were not hard lines in the sand. There's probably a lot of exchange going back and forth between Timnah and Zorah. Trade. Maybe a few skirmishes along the way, but certainly not what the Lord has prescribed. So because of this, the influence is creeping in. And here we see it, right? In chapter 14, in these first 4 verses. The pagan influence, what's wrong with this picture? What's Samson doing here? Should we penalize him for wanting a wife from Timnah?
Yes.
Yeah? Yeah.
Do not be all equally yoked.
That's true. That comes later, but the pagan influence from by taking a wife from one outside, and you see mom and dad in verse 3 landing on that theologically there. That's not someone who you should be going after for with regards to a wife, and in language that seems very reminiscent of all the way back to Genesis 3. Oh, she looks good to me. Take for yourself a wife. We've seen that language before. Just like Eve's taking an apple. It looked good. It seemed good to all that. Verse 4 though kind of lays out the trajectory. It's kind of a subtle verse, but it's something we're going to kind of look at because it helps us to kind of ride the tension that'll be set up through the rest of the Samson account. However, his father and his mother did not know that it was of the Lord. If we just stop there, what's of the Lord here? That's not a statement to say that, it was okay for Samson to take a wife from Timnah. That's not what that means, right? But what does it mean?
God knew what was going on.
Yeah.
And he was going to use it.
Yeah. It's what we've been seeing all along. The Lord's using these deliverers, these military deliverers, for His agenda despite themselves and despite the chaos that's around. It was of the Lord means, there in verse 4, there's a divine agenda still in operation here. That's what's going on. Yeah. So there's going to be some divine intervention, and what's going to happen here, we'll have elements of it behind the scenes, if we could just see it. The Lord's at work. So that's what we would expect to see. All right. So let's see here. Let's just move on to the next slide. All right. Well, let's see here. Yeah. Right away in verse 5. Let's take a look at what happens next. The action picks up here pretty quick, and the pace. Let's see here. Caitlin, where are you? There you are, in the back. Could you read in verse 5?
So Samson goes down to Timnah with his father and his mother, and he comes as far as the vineyards of Timnah. And behold, a young lion came roaring towards him. The Spirit of the Lord came on him mightily, and so he tore him as one tears a young goat, though he had nothing in his hand. But he did not tell his father or his mother what he had done. And so when he went down, he talked to a woman, and she looked good to Samson. And when he returned later to take her, he turned aside to look at the carcass of the lion, and behold, a swarm of bees and honey were in the body of the lion. And so he scraped the honey with his hands, and he went on eating as he went. When he came to his father and his mother, he gave them some of it, and they ate it. But he did not tell them that he had scraped the honey out of the body of the lion. And then his father went down to the woman, and Samson made a feast there, for the young men customarily did this. When they saw him, they brought 30 companions to be with him.
Okay, let's pause there. So in verse 5 we have this seemingly random lion attack, but we're reminded here of the lion attack in terms of what the Lord is doing. I think this, the divine encounter here is really as a means of protecting Samson, giving him strength here for this particular lion attack. Because we see in the details there in verse 6, the Spirit, capital S, Spirit of the Lord, came upon him mightily. God has Samson, and Samson is God's man for the job. in terms of what we'll see, is really his agenda is continuing to exert pressure back against the Philistines. God has an agenda in terms of bringing judgment against the Philistines, and he's going to do that like he did with Shamgar before. Now we've got Samson. So we don't turn this into Samson had his hallelujah moment, or the Holy Spirit came and filled Samson, or he became a Christian on this day, or anything like that. The Holy Spirit's coming upon. It's not in the sense of the New Testament, I don't think, but we've got the Spirit coming. This is a Spirit coming upon for a particular task or agenda. And as quickly as the Spirit comes for this job and what is accomplished, the Spirit then, kind of lifts off. But God intervenes. He brings about what he needs to, and then it's back to normal life kind of thing. Verse 7. There in the details, in the Hebrew, verse 7, so he went down and talked to the woman, and the Hebrew says she was right in Samson's eyes, kind of echoes what? The thesis statement of the author of Judges. What was right in his own eyes? Everyone was doing what was right in his own eyes. So here we have a little connection to that overarching thesis statement of the whole book of Judges. Here's one example, micro example, of some individual doing what was right in his own eyes. So I'm just trying to connect this all together. And in verse 9, it just seems kind of, again, in a kind of comic book kind of way, kind of gross. What's wrong with this picture? We always want to ask that question. Is there something wrong with this picture?
Yeah.
What is it?
It's a lack of practical holiness that's laid out in Leviticus, like with the dead animals and things like that.
Yeah, maybe it's if we look at the details, it's going against the tide of his Nazirite status, right? Nazirite. There's laws of clean and unclean. There's all kinds of violations here, and there's a little bit of deception here with regards to feeding his family and then not telling them. There's.
Does that make them unclean too, by nature of it?
Yeah, just the uncleanness of this. So again, it's an illustration of not only is he doing what was right in his own eyes with regards to the finding of this woman in verse 7, but doing what was right in his own eyes with regards to, his flippant attitude with regards to the honey and the lion carcass, a dead, decaying animal. So there's lots of wrong things with this picture. And that's what the author, he's screaming off the page here as we're kind of maybe invited to snicker to ourselves, but this is a world turned upside down. It's not the way it should be. So we're going down here really quick. So in verses 12 through 18, let's have, let's see, it's Benjamin Attic. Are you here?
Yeah.
There you are, over there.
What,
Yeah, do you have a question?
what,
Oh, okay.
chapter 5?
That's right. Chapter 14, beginning in verse 12. Now we get into the riddle section. That's why I have a riddle up here. I don't know the answer to that, by the way. I hope it's not a huge distraction. You'll be thinking about it all day, right? Maybe someone can figure it out as we're having the text read. What a distraction. That actually is working against me here. So all of you will be thinking, what is this? This is a riddle. Well, that's the point of the text here. Samson's riddling everybody. Go ahead. Start reading in verse 12.
Then Samson said to them, "Let me now propound a riddle to you. If you will indeed tell it to me within the 7 days of the feast and find it out, then I will give you 39 linen wraps and 30 changes of clothes. But if you are unable to tell me, then you shall give me 30 linen wraps and 30 changes of clothes." And they said to him, "Propound your riddle, that we may hear it." You said through 14?
Yeah, just keep reading a little bit there.
So he said to them, "Out of the eater comes something to eat, and out of the strong came something sweet. But they could not tell the riddle in 3 days.
Yeah, keep going.
Then it came on the 4th day that they said to Samson's wife, 'Entice your husband so that he will tell us this riddle, or we will burn you and your father's house with fire. Have you invited us to impoverish us? Is this not so?" Samson's wife wept before him and said, "You only hate me, and you do not love me. You have propounded a riddle to the sons of my people, and have not told it to me." And he said to her, "Behold, I have not told it to my father or mother, so should I tell you?"
One more verse.
All right. However, she wept before him 7 days while their feast lasted. And on the seventh day he told her, because she pressed him so hard. She then told the riddle to the sons of her people.
So it's just a little bit humorous. We've got this wife who's weeping for 7 days, and not that, it's just a bit comical, and, what's going on here? Where's this story going? And all of a sudden, in verse 19, the Spirit of the Lord came mightily upon him, and he went down to Ashkelon and killed 30 of them and took their spoil, gave the changes of clothes to those who had told the riddle, and his anger burned, and he went up to his father's house. But Samson's wife was given to his companion who had been his friend. So there's deception, there's the riddling and the trickery, and we've got this ongoing story, but we still see that the Lord's little glimpses of when the Spirit of the Lord comes upon, there's going to be the continuation of that divine agenda. And we keep going with the account in chapter 15. One other episode of divine judgment in the midst of the world turned upside down for Samson. So Samson's going to impose 2 rounds of revenge and judgment now against the Philistines. And we have in verses 1 through 5. Let's take a look at that. Let's see here. Go over to, sorry. Here we go. Let's see. Cole, could I have you read? I haven't had you read yet, so let's have you read chapter 15, verses 1 through 5.
But after a while, in the time of wheat harvest, Samson visited his wife with a young goat and said, "I will go into my wife in her room." But her father did not let him enter. Her father said, "I really thought that you hated her intensely, so I gave her to your companion. Is not her younger sister more beautiful than she? Please let her be yours instead." Samson then said to them, "This time I shall be blameless in regard to the Philistines when I do them harm." Samson went and caught 300 foxes and took torches and turned the fox's tail and put one torch in the middle between 2 tails. When he had set fire to the torches, he released the foxes into the standing grain of the Philistines, thus burning up both the shocks and the standing grain, along with the vineyards and groves.
Okay, we have another illustration of unconventional activity. In this case, it's not a full-out war, but it's one person against. So it's kind of the same thing as the Gideon episode. One person against how many? But this unconventional way of delivering judgment. Is Samson as blameless as he claims in verse 3? Yeah, there's some signals there. So we see some things in chapter, keep going there in verse 6 through 9. The Philistines said, "Who did this?" And they said, "Samson, the son-in-law of the Timnite, because he took his wife and gave her to his companion." So the Philistines came up and burned her and her father with fire. Shock value. And Samson said to them, "Since you act like this, I'll surely take revenge on you. But after that, I will quit." Will he really quit? There's lots of...
One more and I'm done.
Yeah, what's a kind of shocking questions here. And he struck them ruthlessly with the great slaughter, another Shamgar situation. He went down and lived in the cleft of the rock of Edom. And the Philistines went up and camped in Judah and spread out in Lehi. And the men of Judah said, "Why have you come up against us?" And they said, We've come up to bind Samson in order to do to him as he did to us. So now we've got the posse here and the men of Judah. And what happens next? They turn Samson over, right, to the Philistine posse, bound by ropes. Verse 14. When he came to Lehi, the Philistines shouted as they met him, and again, here we go. The Spirit of the Lord came upon him mightily, so that the ropes that were on his arms were as flax that is burned with fire, and the bonds dropped from his hands. And he found the fresh jawbone of a donkey, and he reached out, took it, and killed 1,000 men with it. And Samson said, "With the jawbone of a donkey, heaps upon heaps, With the jawbone of a donkey I've killed 1,000 men. So, there we go, another cycle of judgment.
So these are the people of Judah angry with him and the Philistines. Is that two different groups of people?
No, I think that the Philistines here are in...
Okay.
Yeah, they had come to Judah.
Okay.
The Philistines were in Judah at that time, verse 14. So we got this ongoing cycle. And then where does it go? We finally get to Judges. Let's move to Judges 16. And then this is probably the most well-known of the cycles of judgment that we see in the Samson cycle. Another one where Samson seems to be out of control. But yet again, the Lord is going to work through Samson despite even himself. He meets up again, as we see, with another pagan woman. Let's chapter 16, verse 1. And Samson went to Gaza, that Philistine city, saw a harlot there, and went into her. So he's out of control, Samson. Verse 5, and the lords of the Philistines came up to her and said, so now we've got deception going on. These Philistines are really befuddled and beside themselves. We really got to figure out this guy. What's his Achilles heel? Go find out for us. Entice him, verse 5, and see where his great strength lies and how we may overpower him, that we may bind him to afflict him. Then we will each give you 1,100 pieces of silver. So this is Delilah, right? And without covering all the details, we're going to have several rounds of Samson and the exchange between Delilah. It escalates in verse 16, and it came about when she was pressing him daily with her words and urging him that his soul was annoyed to death. Yes, it would be comical. It's like, oh, we're laughing again in the book of Judges. And he tells her all that was in his heart and said to her, a razor has never come on my head, for I've been a Nazirite to God from my mother's womb. Really? If I am shaved, then my strength will leave me, and I shall become weak and be like any other man. Really? Yeah, where's his strength from? The strength. Yeah, and so there's a theological kind of emphasis here where just as Israel as a nation is unwilling to recognize the source of her strength, right? In terms of the military battles that need to take place. Here's a microcosm of Israel. Samson embodies Israel, I would say, as an individual. And here he's not being up front with a pagan and admitting the source of his strength. He's putting it on his hair. So the irony here is that it actually gets put on his hair. See what the Lord does? That's what the way you want to call it, then, Samson. I'll make that happen too. Let's whittle your army down to 300. See what you do then. There's really kind of a continuity there, I see with what the Lord's doing, the whittling down and really focusing the attention on what it needs to be. So Samson's bound in chains. He ends up being dragged into the house of the Philistine leaders. He's placed between two pillars, perhaps looking like that. That's actually a temple in Philistine. It could have been something like that. And the irony is actually verses 25. Let's take a look at what happened. So it happened when they were, this is in chapter 16, verse 25. So it happened when they were in high spirits that they said, call for Samson that he may amuse us. You see the irony? The irony there, that Philistines think that they've got Samson right where they want him, but they don't recognize that really who they're trying to trap is the Lord himself. The Lord's not going to be trapped by any pagan nation. So they called for Samson from the prison, and he entertained them, and then they made him stand between the pillars. Then Samson said to the boy who was holding his hand, let me feel the pillars on which the house rests, that I may lean against them. That's what gets Samson into the Hall of Fame of Faith. right there in the next line, actually a couple lines down. The impact, now the house was full of men and women. All the lords of the Philistines were there, about 3,000 men and women on the roof, looking and being entertained while Samson was amusing them. Verse 28 is what gets him into the Hall of Fame of Faith. Samson calls on, notice the change, right? Capital L-O-R-D, and says, "Oh, capital L-O-R-D," actually that's Adonai God, the Lord God, "please remember me and please strengthen me just this time. I'm acknowledging you as my source of strength. Sorry about that, Lord. Oh God, that I may once be avenged of the Philistines for my 2 eyes. And by the way, Lord, I'm sorry that I've not quite been in line with your agenda. Now I get it." See? So, 2 things happen on that day, and the Grinch's heart grew 10 times bigger. Right? It's that kind of, that's the Grinch, he picks up the sleigh and just, they probably borrowed that from the Samson account. If you think about it, it's the same kind of thing. And Samson grabbed the 2 pillars on which the house rested, braced himself against them, the one on his right, the other on his left, and Samson said, "Let me die with the Philistines." And he bent with all his might, and the house fell, the lords and all the people who were in it. The dead whom were killed at his death were more than those whom he killed in his life. And that's the end of Samson. You see where it goes. You see the author of the author of Judges is not going to let us get away with the real agenda that's writing through this book. God has an agenda. It was the agenda from the very beginning. The whole reason Israel's in the land, one of the reasons that they needed to bring judgment against these pagans who are still hanging around. And if the Lord can't do it through an army, He's going to do it through individuals until He can get to that place where Israel needs to be with regards to, doing it the right way. So we keep moving. All right. Just when you needed a break, there's more. More willy-nilly in the book of Judges. It just kind of continues to go from bad to worse. And this is everybody know who this is, right? Mr. Collins from the Pride and Prejudice BBC series. Not the most recent, what's her name? Keira Knightley series. Not to be confused with the Bollywood series Pride and Prejudice. Or maybe 2 or 3 other versions that I've seen in my married life. But I don't know if I've said this already, but I always encourage my young college students, when I teach college students, I'd say, you men need to step up. You need to be willing to, if you want to be a real man, you need to be willing to watch Pride and Prejudice with your wife on a date night. Or, any of the Downton Abbey series, or any other Victorian age series that your wife wants to watch. You've got to be willing to do that to be a real man. And they all balk at me and throw tomatoes and all that stuff. But I think it's true, you just got to turn off the football game. And, we've been watching and enjoying the series Poldark recently. This is Sunday night activity, Poldark. Some of you guys are looking at me like, what? Poldark? Yeah, Poldark, Anyway, so I'll just move on from there. So, chapter 17. We've got Mr. Collins coming on the scene. I'm picturing him as the wandering Levite. So unnamed, we don't know his name. This portrayal of this Levite who should have been in Jerusalem tending to the temple and the spiritual needs of the people. Who instead is out roaming around, apparently looking for a job. That's what we have going on here. Let's take a look at chapter 17, beginning in verse 5. Let's see here. Tamara, could I have you read over here? Beginning in chapter 17, verse 5.
And the man Micah had a shrine, and he made an ephod and household idols, and consecrated one of his sons that he might become his priest. In those days there was no king in Israel. Every man did what was right in his own eyes.
Okay, let's just pause there. So, there's the thesis statement that comes back, and I think that's emphatic from the author. He's reminding us again that this is another example of this little microcosm here. People doing whatever was right in their own eyes. Everybody's doing whatever they want to in their own eyes. You've got this, I should have started at the very beginning. You've got Micah and his household and this account here at the beginning. Let's start reading there, actually. Let's go back to, start reading in verse 1. Chapter 17, verse 1.
Now there was a man of the hill country of Ephraim whose name was Micah. He said to his mother, the 1,100 pieces of silver which were taken from you, about which you uttered a curse in my hearing, behold, the silver is with me. I took it. And his mother said, blessed be my son by the Lord. He then returned the 1,100 pieces of silver to his mother, and his mother said, I wholly dedicate the silver from my hand to the Lord for my son to make a graven image and a molten image. Now therefore I will return them to you. So when he returned the silver to his mother took 200 pieces of silver and gave them to the silversmith, who made them into a graven image and a molten image, and they were in the house of Micah. And the man Micah had a shrine, and he made an ephod and a household idols, and consecrated one of his sons that he might become his priest.
Okay, let's just stop there. I needed that context for verse 5 because, we ask ourselves the question like we've been asking all along, what's wrong with this picture? Here's another extreme example of that which they were doing whatever was right in their own eyes. Here's a great illustration of what I think is, if you describe this 400-year period, we call it the settlement, post-conquest, you've got this idea of syncretism. I think I've mentioned that before. When you have syncretism, you've got a combination of the Lord, Yahweh, plus fill in the blank. So we can have Yahweh, and Yahweh is going to be prominently displayed and referred to in this account in the same context with other, whatever the other is. And in this case, the details come out in the establishment or the manufacture of the molten image, the graven image, and down in verse 5, this little shrine and ephod, household idols. Of course, an ephod has two meanings in the biblical context. You've got the priestly garment, which is the right application, but in this case, it's probably a little, I can only picture maybe a little figurine dressed up as to be a god, little g god, a little representation of one of the gods of the pagan gods of that time. So this is syncretism, and what's interesting is the spiritual motivation that's driving Micah and his household. You see that. Let's see, where did I say? Okay, let's just keep going here. So I'm going to pick up with, so after the thesis statement in, verse 5, Micah, he made a shrine and ephod, household idols, consecrated one of his, and he consecrated one of his sons that he might become his priest. In those days, there was no king in Israel, but it was right in his own eyes. Verse 7. Now, there was a young man from Bethlehem in Judah, of the family of Judah, who was a Levite, and he was staying there. Then the man departed from the city, from Bethlehem in Judah, to stay wherever he might find a place. What's wrong with that picture? He had a place. Yeah, his place was to be serving in the center of gravity for the religious center of the day. Temple hadn't been built yet, so the tabernacle was still the center of that activity. The Levitical priest should have been helping the people deal with sin and ministering in the temple and doing all of those activities that Moses had described in some of those earlier Torah books that we covered earlier. Mike to him, where did you come from? And he said, I'm a Levite from Bethlehem in Judah, and I'm going to stay wherever I might find a place. Micah says, dwell with me, be a father and a priest to me, and I will give you 10 pieces of silver a year, a suit of clothes, and your maintenance. So the Levite went in because the price was right. You see that? What's wrong with this picture? We don't do ministry in response to the dollar signs. That's one sermon takeaway. We got to be careful about that. We go where the call of God takes us. Call of God for this wandering Levite was obviously not here. That wasn't God's call on his life. He should have known better. Levite agreed to live with the man, and the young man became to him like one of his sons. So Micah consecrated the Levite and the young man because his priest, and he became his priest and lived in the house of Micah. Then Micah said very proudly, and after sticking out his chest and beaming with pride over his household, all the pieces are in place. He says, "Now I know that Yahweh will prosper me, seeing I have a Levite as a priest." So, my synchronous activity, my household shrine, and all the things that I do here to express my paganism will be authorized because I've got one who knows this guy. So I've got everything, all my bases are covered. So this is kind of the both and world of syncretism that we see creeping in. And that, as I said, I think I said that before, that was the big threat Moses warns against. The whole reason for driving out the nations around was that this would happen. And this is the slow fade to forgetting God, to forgetting Him. This is what happens. This is the chipping away at God as King over His people. So let's see where we go with this. Well, that's the end of that account in chapter 17, but we're not through with the account of the household of Micah. Let's move to the overlap is into chapter 18. So the story of Micah and his overpaid Levitical priest overlaps into chapter 18 with a reminder that there was no king. Again, in chapter 18, verse 1, you see that? In those days, there was no king in Israel. That's half of the thesis statement. In those days, the tribe of the Danites was seeking an inheritance for themselves to live in. For until that day, an inheritance had not been allotted to them as a possession among the tribes of Israel. So there's still some unfinished business here with regards to the Danites and their land allotment. So they're having to send spies in and prepare for a battle here. They're going to have to conquer some territory. And interestingly, they run into a familiar voice and they request guidance from a priest. And that's what we see in verse 3 in chapter 18. When they were near the house of Micah, they recognized the voice of the young man, the Levite. And they turned aside there and said, "Who brought you here? And what are you doing in this place?" You see the irony there? Kind of connects back. I'm looking for a place. What are you doing in this place? It's almost like that's what God's asking him. And what do you have here? And he said to them, "Thus and so has Micah done to me, and he's hired me, and I've become his priest." And they said to him, "Okay, well that's the case. We're okay with that." Then inquire of... Notice the name change. See, it's capital G-O-D instead of L-O-R-D. "Please that we may know whether our way on which we are going will be prosperous." And the priest said to them, "Go in shalom. Your way in which you are going has the Lord's approval." So the 5 men departed and came to Laish and saw the people who were in it living in security after the manner of the Sidonians, quiet and secure, for there was no ruler humiliating them for anything in the land, and they were far from the Sidonians and had no dealings with anyone. So they hear from the priest, and the Danites will return to battle with 600 men in verses 11 through 13. Let's look at that. Then from the family of the Danites, from Zorah and from Eshtaol, 600 men, armed with weapons of war, set out. They went up and camped at Kiriath Jearim of Judah. Therefore they called that place Ma'aneh Dan. To this day, behold, it is west of Kiriath Jearim. And they passed from there to the hill country of Ephraim and came to the house of Micah. All right. So the Danites return to the house of Micah, and they decide to take the ephod and the household idols for themselves in verses 17 through 18. So 5 men who went to spy out the land went up and entered there. They took the graven image, the ephod, the household idols, which Micah had worked so hard to set up and establish and consecrate, and the molten image. And while the priest stood by the entrance of the gate with the 600 men armed with weapons of war. And verse 18, and when they and when these went into Micah's house and took the graven image, the ephod, the household idols, and the molten image, the priest said to them, "What are you doing?" And they said to him, "Be silent. Put your hand over your mouth and shh. Come with us and be a father and a priest to us. It's better for you to be a priest to the house of one man or to a priest to a tribe and a family in Israel." And the priest's heart was glad. And he took the ephod and household idols and the graven image and went among the people. And he basically got a pay raise. So verses 19 through 20. So that's interesting. Micah discovers the situation. He rallies his own men and he begins to pursue these Danites. But discovers that the Danites were too strong for him. So the Danites come upon the city of Laish and destroy it. They rebuild it and they settle in it. Once there, they set up for themselves, under the Levites' oversight, a graven image, interestingly. And in verse 30, we have an interesting final reference here, which is really interesting. I'm not sure, I'm going to have to dig in a little bit more. Verse 30, and the sons of Dan set up for themselves the graven image. And Jonathan, the son of Gershom, the son of Manasseh, and he and his sons were priests to the tribe of the Danites until the day of the captivity of the land. So they set up for themselves Micah's graven image, which he had made all the time that the house of God was at Shiloh. One little detail there. And it's interesting, of all things, it's one of those, sorry about that, one of those textual witnesses discussions. So textual criticism. In verse 30, what's really interesting is the term Manasseh. All right? So scholars that look at this, that are experts in this field of looking at the older versions, in this case the Septuagint, the Latin Vulgate, and some of those older textual references, instead of reading Manasseh, they read Moses there, which is really interesting, Moses. So you see Dan set up for themselves the graven image, and Jonathan, the son of Gershom, the son of Moses. It's interesting, could this be, I guess in this case would be the grandson of Moses, leading pagan, authorized idolatry here in this city. Possibly. Don't break a church up over this, but it's part of the discussion. And it's interesting how quickly, and this is only more amplification on perhaps the downward spiral, because we just have 2 generations in now from Moses, perhaps his grandson, continuing as a priest, but then not the right kind of spiritual leadership. We've got this, authorization of this syncretism going on in Israel, but it's it's part of the scholarly discussion. I wouldn't break a church up over it.
I got a question. So is the timeline of Judges, is it a linear timeline, or is it, or a lot of these judges, like some of them operating at the same time?
Oh, yeah. That's hard to piece together. I think that there's some overlap going on in the accounts. I wouldn't think of it as, I presented my downward spiral as linear, because I think that's the author's strategy. Mm-hmm. But it's difficult to know if there's overlap in the exact precision that we'd look for in our Western mind. I think there's probably a lot of overlap.
Yeah, it makes sense, because a lot of them are dealing with different people.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So it's a little more tricky to piece together. I suppose I could find a scholar that's devoted his whole life to doing that, piecing together the precise timeline. I think it's we have to remind ourselves history and theology. It's historiography, so the author's perfectly fine to be selective. He's not bringing in every account, and he's organizing it. He's got an organizational strategy, like what we saw with Moses and the second millennial treaty form that we talked about for the book of Deuteronomy. It's those kinds of things at work. All right, so let's move on. Hey, how about if I finish out our discussion today without taking a break? Would you all be okay with that? Finishing early then?
Yeah.
Okay, I'll do that. We'll just press on. I got a little bit of discussion here at the end. It won't take too long, so let's just keep going here. Crazy picture, I know. Judges is going to end, the book of Judges, out of control. A world truly turned upside down. In Judges chapter 19, let's look at verses 22. Let's see, Judges 19, verse 22. This is the account of the Levitical priest's concubine being degraded in this whole context. I'm not going to cover all the details, but while they were making merry, in verse 22, behold, the men of the city, certain worthless fellows, surrounded the house, pounding the door. They spoke to the owner of the house, the old man, saying, bring out the man who came into your house that we may have sexual relations with him. Verse 23, and then the man, the owner of the house, went in to them and said, no, my fellows, please do not act so wickedly, since this man has come into my house. Do not commit this act of folly. But here's my virgin daughter and his concubine. Please let me bring them out, that you may ravish them and do to them whatever you wish. But don't commit such an act of folly against this man. But the man would not listen to him, and so the man seized his concubine, brought her out to them, and they raped and abused her all night until morning, and let her go the approach of dawn. And so this is what happens next. As you probably know, this graphic detail of what this man does in response, and shouting out the atrocity of the event, what happens, and cutting up the concubine, sending the pieces out to the tribes and all of that. Here's the point with all this. Here's the big idea in this account. Israel has become Sodom. How's that for a punchline? And now we've got what happens next. Israel is going to rise up in Judges chapter 20. There's going to be one faction within Israel rising up against another faction within Israel. Chapter 20, verses 1 through 2. Then all the sons of Israel from Dan to Beersheba, including the land of Gilead, came out, and the congregation assembled as one man, the Lord, at Mizpah. And the chiefs of all the people, even the tribes of Israel, took their stand in the assembly of the people of God, 400,000 foot soldiers who drew the sword. Now the sons of Benjamin heard that the sons of Israel had gone up to Mizpah. And the sons of Israel said, tell us, how did this wickedness take place? So the Levite, the husband of the woman who was murdered, answered and said, I came with my concubine to spend the night at Gibeah, which belongs to Benjamin. But the men of Gibeah rose up against me and surrounded the house at night because of me. They intended to kill me. Instead, they ravished my concubine so that she died. And I took hold of my concubine, cut her into pieces, and sent her throughout the land of Israel's inheritance. For they have committed a lewd and disgraceful act in Israel. Behold, all you sons of Israel, give your advice and counsel here. So this is Israel's rising up against itself. And in verses 18 through 24, what do they rise up for? What do they rise up against? And now the sons of Israel rose in verse 18, and they went up to Bethel and inquired of God and said, who shall go up for us to battle against the sons of Benjamin? Then the Lord said, Judah shall go up first. What's interesting about this, now you've got tribe against tribe within Israel. You've got brother against brother, almost echoes of the Joseph narrative, There's fratricides coming around the corner. We've gone back that far, and Now we've got almost like a holy war, one tribe against another, or tribes against another. The holy war, Israel is bringing about a holy war against itself, brother against brother, until one tribe is almost completely destroyed. That's what we have going on here. And we won't cover all the details of this account. But one of the things I just wanted to end here with regards to the author and his thesis statement. Let's go to the very end of the book in chapter 21, verses 23 through 25. Thankfully, though, we do have a little bit of relief when we find out at the very end that the tribe of Benjamin is not completely decimated and left without a way of continuing on as a tribe. We see that in verse 23. And the sons of Benjamin did so and took wives according to their number from those who were dancing, whom they carried away. They went and returned to their inheritance and rebuilt cities and lived in them. And the sons of Israel departed from there at that time, every man to his tribe and family, and each one of them went out from there to his inheritance. In those days, there was no king in Israel. Everyone did that was right in his own eyes. And the curtains closed. And the movie stopped. And what did the people do? How do they respond? That's really the key. The author who is writing this book asks a pretty significant question here at the end. There was no king in Israel. And I've thought a lot about this over this last, the way I work is I pick up a project and then put it on the shelf and come back and pick it up again. And I've been thinking about this a little bit. And I really don't think this, the future idea of the king, the immediate next thing that has to happen, according to the author, where he says there's no king in Israel, I don't think of that. He's just waiting. Well, it's just, there's going to be a king, an earthly king is all that it's about. So that forward-looking idea, because we know that in the history books, the next book that comes after Ruth is Samuel, that'll get us to Israel's first king, Saul. And we know how that goes. We'll get there next semester. But here's what I think. I think that the author's also looking back. He's looking back, but he's also looking forward. And his forward view, I don't think is just going to stop with any earthly king that's going to come down the pike. I'll show you. My suspicion is, I think the author of Judges is going to be a little bit prophetic. And he's even looking at the final solution. He may even be suggesting, based on what we've seen so far, Genesis through Joshua, that we've got to be looking for a different kind of king altogether, perhaps. So let's just end with this. And this is speculation, not something to break a church up over. It's just some trying to piece together some things. So this is a research project of your professor, so I'm just sharing it with you. And if you look at the idea of killing a king, I know that's harsh language, but the idea of killing a king doesn't mean cutting off one's head necessarily in the ancient world. In the ancient world, killing a king language is used in correspondence and kings writing to each other. And it has to do with the breaking of a treaty or a covenant relationship. So the idea of when you kill a king, it might look something like this, and this comes right out of an English translation of a text. At one occasion, that guy's brothers caused him trouble. They killed him. How did they do that? They drove him out of the land, and he came to my father's presence. My father did not reject him. So the idea of being technically killed as a king is the idea of dethronement and then being driven out of your land, the idea of exile. That's how you kill a king. The king's still alive. He's just ceased to be king by dethronement and exile. And that's upon the breach of covenant fidelity, or infidelity, you might say. The killing is done typically by the suzerain to the vassal, so the greater king to the lesser king. The greater king kills the lesser king by dethroning him and driving him out of the land. So that's what we have going on in the ancient world, this idea. Well, in the biblical context, what's interesting, and I go back to Moses in Deuteronomy chapter 8, and let's just remind ourselves of some of the things that Moses had high on his agenda for Israel. in going to the land. And we see that in verse 11, chapter 8. Beware lest you forget the Lord your God by not keeping his commandments and his ordinances and his statutes, which I am commanding you today, lest when you have eaten and are satisfied, when you've built good houses and lived in them, and when your herds and your flocks multiply, your silver, your gold multiply, and all that you have multiplies, then your heart becomes proud, and you forget the Lord your God, who has brought you from the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery. By the way, he's the one who led you through the great and terrible wilderness with its fiery serpents and scorpions and thirsty ground, which there was no water. He brought water for you out of the rock of flint in the wilderness. He even fed you manna, which your fathers did not know, that he might humble you and that he might test you to do good for you in the end. Otherwise you might say in your heart, my power and strength in my hand made me this wealth. But you shall remember the Lord your God, for it is he who is giving you power to make wealth, that he might confirm his covenant, which he swore to your fathers, as it is to this day. And if it comes about, if you ever forget the Lord your God, and go after other gods, and serve them, and worship them, I testify against you today, that you shall surely perish. Interestingly, on my thesis, the idea of ceasing to exist as a nation means the king is dethroned and the nation is exiled from the land, to cease to exist, to perish. Like the nations that the Lord makes to perish before you, aka conquest and settlement, so you shall perish because you would not listen to the voice of the Lord your God. So, is Israel ever in this situation, talk to the hand because the face ain't listening? That's the book of Judges. They've gotten to this place where they have forgotten God. My thesis is forgotten God as king. They have demonstrated this idea of getting a proud heart and failing to acknowledge that the Lord is in their midst. You've got all these little elements of Samson. I don't acknowledge the Lord as the source of my strength. You've got all of these examples of Israel forgetting God. You've got Micah. I'll go find a place. I don't have to be a priest in the religious center of the day. I'll go off and find a better job somewhere. This forgetting, doing whatever you want to, and in your own eyes, is the idea of forgetting the Lord. So, is Israel dethroned God as king? Is that part of the thesis statement of the author of Judges? There was no king in Israel? That's my hunch. So he's got this thesis statement pivotally placed at the end of his historical account, bringing in all of what has gone before. And the whole big idea that, remember we said as an initial bookend, the beginning of class, God is king. That's Moses' big idea. That's where it starts. Genesis 1, 2, and 3, all the way through. So that's never supposed to change, that God is king idea. But what happens if God's people forget him? It's really dangerously close to this idea of them dethroning God as king. Not that God is dethroned in the eternal realm. He's always on his throne. But remember what I said, kind of the earthly, we've got this kind of, some of these things that are eternally true, kind of the eternal, things like the design of the temple and the details and God is king, and some of these things find earthly expression in the details of the text. So the name of Yahweh is going to find earthly expression. God is king and his rule expressed through his people. The name, the image of God being expressed in the image of God in humanity. There's all of these eternal truths that come down to find earthly expression. So my hunch is that this author of Judges may just be, with his prophet hat on, is seeing the big picture. Like I drew that line that kind of goes up like that, and this is the God as king idea, which is always true, despite the people, at any time in Israel's history. And the whole pivot of, that's not the right word, the whole big picture of history will come back to this idea. And that's that final bookend idea that we talked about in Zechariah, where God is king and the day of the Lord. So the idea, I think I've talked about this, is the idea of if God is dethroned as king, if that's what's just happened in this 400-year period we call the book of Judges, maybe it's the question that the author of Judges is asking: when will God be rethroned? When will it be true where there's an earthly expression of that eternal reality again? On planet Earth, knock on wood. And my hunch is that this is the day of the Lord. And sorry for the Sunday school flannelgram size style picture, but there it is. All of those images that we grew up loving in church and seeing in Sunday school class, those pictures all got it right with regards to this. There'll be a day when God is king, when He's on His throne, and we're going to move out of this 400-year period of chaos. And the question of when will the king be rethroned, we'll see it next spring when we talk about the Davidic covenant. There's going to be elements show up there of the everlasting kingdom. And the seed, the promised seed from Genesis 3:15. We'll come back to that. There's going to be one who will emerge from the line of David, who will come and bring about this king, this new kingdom, this new kind of kingdom, and this rethronement of the king. And it's an idea that we see starting to come back with. We'll turn to a few of these prophets as we just wrap up. Let's turn to Micah. Micah chapter 4. I love this text and this imagery. Here we go. I was in the wrong prophet. Won't look at all of these, but this one is the one that's repeated also in Isaiah chapter 2, verses 1 through 4. But in Micah chapter 4, the details of the promised day of the Lord, right? Verse 1, it'll come about in the last days. That's the day of the Lord reference. That the mountain of the house of the Lord, that's the residence of His throne, will be established as the chief of the mountains. It'll be raised above the hills, as the peoples will stream up to it. And many nations will come up and say, "Come, let us go up to the mountain of the Lord and to the house of the God of Jacob, that He may teach us about His ways, and that we may walk in His paths. For from Zion will go forth the law, the Torah, even the word of the Lord from Jerusalem." And there's this picture of the establishment of God as king. And I love that passage in Zechariah. Let's just end there. So turn to Zechariah chapter 14. And Zechariah is one of those post-exilic prophets, interestingly, delivering his prophetic message to the group that's come out of exile, from that Babylonian exile for 70 years. And in Zechariah chapter 14, the day of the Lord is announced in chapter 14, verse 1. "Behold, a day is coming for the Lord, when the spoil taken from you will be divided among you." That's an interesting description of the conflict that will be coming with the day of the Lord. But then, in verse 6, "And it will become about in that day that there will be no light, the luminaries will dwindle, for it will be a unique day which is known to the Lord, neither day nor night, but it will come about that at evening time there will be light. And it will come about in that day that living waters," we could almost get back to the garden again, right? This living, where's the source of life, "will flow from Jerusalem, half of them toward the sea in the east, and the other half toward the western sea. It will be in summer as well as winter. And the Lord will be king over all of the earth in that day. The Lord will be the only one, and His name the only one." So that full coming back to the God is king and His name, His reputation will be firmly entrenched on that day. And this is what's coming. And I think that maybe that's kind of starting to develop as early as the book of Judges with that thesis statement. So that's my idea with regards to that. With regards to what might be going on with the theology of king and the struggle over king and what kind of king will be the ultimate solution to the problem. We'll see how solid that thesis statement is as we proceed ahead. So thanks for your attention today. We'll finish a little early. All right, thanks.
I'm taking it now.
Feeling better?
No. So they, that's, although no, I'm like, I have problems